welcome to Truth Unto Godliness. I'm your host Michael, and today I just want to give a short little video presentation where I want to defend Philip Melanchthon from some of the unjust slander that has been put up against him, especially as it concerns how a false and misleading translation of a letter of his written to Johann Brenz has been misused to make him seem, at best, very disingenuous and manipulative, and at worst as a lying cheat, to be frank, which is of course a harsh accusation. But I also think this episode highlights a larger problem, namely the problem of misusing bad doctored or false translations, which is a great problem, especially here in our age of a lot of hobbyists inquiring into theology, reading, using, being dependent on secondary sources and translations, which is good and fine. I mean, none of us should retranslate everything, of course, but we do especially need to use prudence and be skeptical when we find a quotation or try to make an argument that is very heavy in the points it's made, very strong in the claims it makes, and just be certain and double check whether the information we are basing this argument on is genuine. And I think that such a thoroughness is sorely lacking in our day and age, where false translations are being misused all too often. So as a kind of test case for that, so to say, I want to share this little presentation with you. So, the malicious misuse of false translations. And sadly, this quote, this passage has been spread around YouTube and around... oh, I was not sharing the right thing. I think we should go with this one. Yes, great. So this quote has been used and shared around both YouTube and Twitter and on blogs, which is quite sad. So let's look at it. So this letter written by Melanchthon to Johann Brenz has been used in AntiLutheran Pimmics ever since at least the 1800s and 1900s, where some Roman Catholics began to really plow through some of the material surrounding Luther and Melanchthon and publish biographies about these men, which sought to hide and to direct their critique and their polemics in a more scholarly shell to make them more trustworthy. And I think some of the worst examples of this comes from Hartmann Grieser and the earlier writer Denif. And both of these wrote highly polemical hit pieces on Martin Luther, with a lot of slander, a lot of unsupported and wicked claims. And sadly, some of these are still popular till this day, though they are, of course, heavily outdated, not to say just plain out false, in some Roman Catholic circles. Of course, not all, and I don't think they're that well known, but sadly, some of the bad fruits are still being passed around, which is sad. Also, it should be said, ironically, that at least for Grieser's polemics, then most of his critique of Luther involves an unfounded and heavy over-reliance on Sigmund Freud's psychoanalyst. And I just need to mention, like, he was a God-rejecting atheistic Jew who hated almost everything good and true and beautiful. And yet this is the kind of weapons that are put against Luther, that blessed man. So yeah, I think that in itself is quite saying. But regardless, Grieser, he is, I think he's probably the, Geisler here, he's probably the man from whom the usage of this quotation, this passage from Melanchthon's letter to Johann Brenz comes from. It's because he mentions it here in a quote, in a book he wrote, where he's quoting the earlier Roman Catholic historian Denif, who was even worse and much more awful in his manner and approach to the historical sources and his lack of care in giving a honest and fair presentation of the facts. So, and this is of course not just something I'm saying. Professor James Atkinson, one of the foremost Luther historians, he wrote concerning these two gentlemen the following quote: "There can be no doubt of the sincerity and conviction of Cochlaeus, who was a historian contemporary with Martin Luther and who wrote scolding critiques of Martin Luther. But neither can there be any doubt that it was he who poisoned the well of historical studies. Roman Catholic historians have drawn their prejudice against Luther from this polemical source, which in its anonymity has an almost total disregard for objective truth and historical facts. Benifle, Grisa, Christiani, Paquer, and Martin, to cite the most famous and influential, have all drunk deep of this poisoned well, too deeply, and lesser historians have adopted their positions. Grisa's intent was to ruin Luther's reputation, and among those who accept him as an authority without reading further, we may suppose that he succeeds altogether too well. Nevertheless, not all Catholic scholars have been convinced." Yeah, quote ended. And I think this is quite telling, and this is, should be helpful in trying to add some context to see to see where the source of this this awful slander against Melanchthon originated. So let's move on. So what did he say? So here I have a quote from Grisa's book, by his biography about Martin Luther, where he quotes from the earlier work written by Benifle, and he brings forward this letter that Melanchthon used against this quotation that Melanchthon presented. So what does he say? Well, to read from around the middle, Brenz is told that he is wrong in clinging to Augustine's fancy, which puts our righteousness in the fulfillment of the law. So this is a quotation from the letter that Melanchthon wrote to Johann Brenz, and already here we have some of the issues that we'll also underscore further. First of all, it's translated as if it was Melanchthon's view that Augustine was wrong or had a fancy, as in a sort of weird or wrong idea. But the issue is that Melanchthon didn't write fancy. He wrote imaginationis, which means something like a concept, mental image, idea. And here we begin to see that you can really color and doctor and change the emphasis of a translation of a sentence by the word choice, and saying Augustine's fancy rather than his idea, his concept, his presentation, or his understanding. You really alter the meaning that is provided. Also, as we can see here later on in the quotation, he writes that Augustine, quote, is not in agreement with the doctrine of Paul, read of Luther, he inserts here, though he comes nearer to it than do the scholastics, or the schoolmen, as translated in this quotation. Well, the issue here is that Melanchthon doesn't say is not in agreement. He literally doesn't say that. That is just a mistranslation. He says, as we will look on here later in the video when we will go through the original Latin text, he says he does not adequately or fully satisfy the meaning of St. Paul, which is to say how you explain it or present the doctrine rather than agreement conceptually. It's a matter of how well or how adequately you describe it. So here, again and again, we see throughout this translation that manipulative translation has been used to skew the translation as presenting a dichotomy between the view of St. Paul and St. Augustine, rather than a difference in emphasis and a difference in terminology, which is just awful. And again, also, the third thing I point out is that he changes the word order so as to manipulate the meaning, which is just, quite awful. And then, of course, he's also guilty of poisoning the well here in the last sentence, where the Roman Catholic polemicist just goes straight out and says, what he means is, quote, and then he just rewrites the quotation to make it say something which he most certainly did not mean. Now, of course, these translations are quite dated and old, as I said, and not really that used, but somehow they still managed to find their way into the modern Roman Catholic discourse and have served as the basis for the rekindling of this controversy. And because these connotations began to be used again between the veteran Roman Catholic apologist Dave Armstrong and another Roman Catholic author, Edwin Tate, then he authored a new translation of the whole letter because he also found some issues with these older translations. And this new translation of Philip Melanchthon, authored by, the Roman Catholic author Edward Tate, has really rekindled the controversy. And it is in this form, usually, that we normally come across the passage in question. So he writes here, quote, Augustine does not fully accord with Paul's pronouncement, even though he gets closer to it than the scholastics. Here we see some marked improvement, rather than saying Augustine does not agree with Paul's announcement, which is just, gross misuse of the text, because Melanchthon says no such thing. Then we have a closer and better approximation here, where he says does not fully accord with Paul's pronouncement, though, as we will see later on, there's also some issues with that wording. But he continues, and I cite Augustine as fully agreeing with us on account of the public conviction about him, even though he does not explain the righteousness of faith well enough. Yes, quote ended. So here we see the crux of the matter. People are grabbing on to this passage and present it as if Melanchthon were saying that St. Augustine does actually not agree with St. Paul, and I cite St. Augustine as agreeing with us because he is, very important and in high regard by the public, and they have high convictions about him. And I do this even though he doesn't explain the righteousness of faith well enough, even though he does not accord with St. Paul's doctrine, etc. This is how this quote has been used by popular and well-known Roman Catholic apologists, and that is really sad, and this frankly needs to be corrected, because it's a gross slander based on bad translation of the text, even though Edward Tate here does a bit to improve the awful state of the purposefully, I suppose, a mistranslation by earlier polemic authors. But yes, so let's say, what does he actually say here? So in the first column to the left, we can see the original Latin of the letter of Philip Melanchthon. And then on the two columns to the right, I offer two different translations of the text. So to give a more accurate and more faithful translation, we can say that what Melanchthon actually writes is the following. Quote, Augustine does not fully satisfy the sense of Paul, and yet he comes closer than the scholastics. And I cite Augustine as straightforwardly agreeing because of the general understanding of him, though he does not sufficiently explain the righteousness of faith. Or to give a slightly different translation, where I try to show some of the semantic range of some of the words employed in the original Latin of Melanchthon, then we may say that he wrote something akin to, quote, Augustine does not satisfy the sense of Paul, and yet he comes closer than the scholastics. And I cite Augustine as certainly or precisely or fully agreeing on account of his persuasion or reputation. With all, even as he does not satisfactorily explicate the righteousness of faith. All right, so what's at play here? The crux of the matter is that Melanchthon is not in any way saying that there is not substantial agreement and a substantial overlap between the doctrine of St. Paul regarding justification, sanctification, and that of the reformers. What he's rather saying is that though there is an overlap substantially and in the essence of the doctrine, then regarding the explication, regarding the terminology being used, then there are some deficiencies in the wordings and formulations used by St. Augustine. And this is the issues here. That's why the central statement is not that he disagrees, not that there's no accordance or overlap, but that St. Augustine does not fully or satisfactorily explain non satis explicit doctrine. And that has to be put in the context of all proper development of doctrine, not in the sense that new doctrines develop and come about, which were lacking in an earlier period. That would be false, and I think a very problematic view. Nor is it the case that this happens because we come to some new understanding where we have to leave off the older understandings, but rather as time goes on, there is a clarification and a way and manner in which the same doctrines are explicated and described more precisely. And this is, of course, also the case regarding the doctrine of justification, where St. Augustine will use the same terminology and the same words in multiple different senses, rather than using different terms for these different concepts, which he clearly differentiates between. So, for example, he will use the term to justify, justificare, to describe both the forgiveness of sins, that we are declared righteous and stand just and righteous before God. And he'll use the same word, justificare, to describe the ongoing process of mortifying sin, growing in sanctity and justice, and coming to a closer conformity with Christ. And this is the case even though he sharply and quite precisely distinguishes these two things conceptually, then he does not adequately distinguish them terminologically. And this is what Melanchthon is getting at, that Augustine does not fully explain or explicate the righteousness of faith because he uses some confusing terminology in describing it, quite akin to how some of the early church fathers need to be read quite charitably and carefully when describing things such as the hypostatic union or the Trinity. Then likewise St. Augustine, though I think it's even less of an issue with the St. Augustine. All right, so also the last thing we might want to note here is that I think that the thorough Augustinian soteriology and understanding of justification, which Melanchthon had, can also be seen confirmed and explicated in quite some detail some years later at the colloquy of Regensburg, where the Roman Catholic papally appointed legate Cardinal Contarini, together with other Roman Catholic theologians, wrote and signed a joint confession and joint understanding of justification with the Protestant party, represented chiefly by Philip Melanchthon and other leading other leading Lutheran and Reformed theologians. And that's also a topic that I have written a bit about and made some video material on, and something I hope to revisit as well in the near future. Okay, so let's look at the result of this debate. So what actually inspired me to make this video is that this critique that I just presented of the translation was something that I shared with my friends on Twitter, and wow, it actually worked. I don't know how. I think maybe one of my Roman Catholic followers must have made Edwin Tate aware of this, because not too long after I had posted the critique of his translation, he actually replied to it on Twitter, which I found quite surprising and very pleasantly so, because he and I, we had a good, respectful back and forth and discussion of some of the translating choices here. And as I have already said, and which I again want to re-emphasize, is that though I found his translation to be lacking and suffering from some serious faults, then it was indeed a great improvement compared to some of the older translations used by the Roman polemicists, such as Grisa. But yeah, he actually engaged in a good back and forth discussion on this issue with me on Twitter. And the result was quite fruitful, because he revisited his translation and actually changed some of these things that I had pointed out. And again, I think that I think that's really a hallmark of integrity, of a honest Christian approach, where we all want to remain humble, even though, of course, we are quite often fully persuaded of our ideas. Then we aren't too proud or too stubborn to actually rethink and change some of our choices, especially as it regards something as difficult and something as multifaceted as translating old Latin text, because sometimes you can give many different correct translations. Not to say that it's often quite difficult to get it all right in the first try. So yeah, here on the right you can see the updated and corrected translation that Edwin Tate has now uploaded to the Parthias blog, where it also was before, and I've just highlighted a few things. So rather than saying that St. Augustine does not accord with or agree with or whatever choice that some of the older Roman Catholic translations have put it, then now Andrew Tate writes, does not St. Augustine, quote, Augustine does not fully do justice to Paul's meaning. And he explained that here in his footnote, literally does not satisfy. And Edwin Tate further goes on to say, quote, I originally translated this as does not accord with, but after some criticism from a Lutheran, I've revisited the translation to make it more accurate. The word I originally translated as pronouncement and now have as meaning is sententiam, which has a broad semantic range. It can mean a short verbal statement, as in our sentence, or the thought or the meaning behind the statement. The latter is probably primary here, so I have revised my translation accordingly. And I think that is, yes, that captures the meaning of Blessed Melanchthon quite well, that he isn't saying that St. Augustine disagrees with St. Paul or the Reformers' understanding, or that there's no, or that there isn't some substantial, real, actual overlap between their understandings, but just that he does not fully satisfy or does not fully do justice to it. There's some room for improvement. There's some potentiality to author it and describe it more precisely. And the second, here shown in green, the second addition or altercation that he made is in the following quote, saying, quote, and I cite Augustine as fully in agreement on account of the public conviction about him, even though he does not explain the righteousness of faith well enough. Here again we have a change to the translation. Rather than saying that, quote, and I cite Augustine as fully in agreement with us, then that has been dropped because that is simply not present in the original Latin text. And Edwin Tate clarifies in his footnote, also shown in green, Melanchthon uses a Greek word which means one who says the same. originally had agrees with us, but it's possible that he means with Paul, so I have omitted the phrase. And I think it's good to omit the phrase because the phrase doesn't have any warrant or any backing in the original text. So it is quite interpretive to add something not found or not having basis in the base text that you're wishing to translate. And even though it makes the quotation a bit more vague as to whether Melanchthon means that Augustine is cited as being in agreement with the Lutherans or as in agreement with St. Paul or whoever, then it's good because one should, in trying to make a faithful translation of a text, also keep some of the vagueness found within the original text in the translation. If one exhausts these vagaries with one's own personal interpretation or one's personal ideas about what the author may have meant, then one is also moving away from the actual text being translated and into one's own interpretation or reading or presentation of the text. So I also think this is good because what Blessed Melanchthon here is saying is that Augustine is cited as fully in agreement with the case, that is, includes both St. Paul meaning and that of the Lutherans, because he is truly in agreement with them, even though he has some terminological issues that make it a bit less clear than this clarification having come around 1,000 years later, just as we don't require or expect the church fathers of the 2nd century to get everything terminologically or semantically 100% correct regarding the doctrine of the Trinity. And the last thing is, as I've also underscored again here in the red, is that he, again, I think this translation also brings out the central crux of the quotation here, namely that the only issue with St. Augustine is that his explication of presentation of the doctrine of justification could be improved by some clarification to the vocabulary and terms being employed by him. Okay, so conclusion. We really need to be careful when using translations, especially when if it's the case that something sounds too good to be true. Because if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is too good to be true. And that is really an issue that we need to be very careful with. I cannot say to you how many times I have come across the most ridiculous claims of quotations from the church fathers, where just from reading it, even before you try to look it up or try to see what the context is, you can just, if you are familiar, for example, with the theology of St. Augustine, then a lot of the time you'll just be able to point out false things being attributed to him. Not too long ago, a few months, I think, a prayer about the Virgin Mary was being passed around on Twitter as being cited as a proof that St. Augustine held to a sort of Roman understanding of the Immaculate Conception, the sinlessness of Mary, and so on. And even before looking it up, which I did later, and which some other people, it was, of course, naturally not just me, but as also some of the Roman Catholics pointed out, this isn't written by St. Augustine. It's either misattributed to him, or maybe it's falsely attributed to him purposefully by a malicious author, because it's a late medieval prayer that has absolutely nothing to do with the pious doctrines of this great saint. And this just happens. So please be careful out there. And it's not the case at all that it's only Roman Catholics that are guilty of this. This happens also to Protestants, to Lutherans, to Eastern Orthodox Christians, where we will try and use a quotation or a passage from a church father because it really seems to prove our case, when in fact that we're only making fool of ourselves and scandalizing our confession by using false information to prove our point. And that it's a disservice to our neighbor, it's a disservice to God, and it's a disservice to the saints, because there can be no rejoicing in falsehood. So yeah, we really need to be careful, and we really need to, especially if we want to base an important argument on something, or if the claim is really is really strong, or if you want to be very confident, then please use prudence, double check the sources, double check against the original text, because if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And yeah, so the very last thing I just want to say is that I think this also serves as a quite good jump off point for the whole discussion of duplex justitia, that is to say, the believer's twofold righteousness, which is a topic that I have been doing a lot of research on recently. And I think this is really the final authentic conclusion that does justice to the whole corpus of St. Augustine's doctrine of justification. And it was really the great crown and synthesis of the medieval reception of the Augustinian doctrine of justification. And this idea of duplex justitia, or twofold righteousness, is something that I hope to make some more videos on, because I think here we actually have the really interesting story of the time where Rome actually conceded that Martin Luther got justification right. But that's a video for a different day. I hope you just enjoyed this little short episode doing justice to Philip Melanchthon, and I hope that you'll share this video, pass it around, and let's put this awful slander, this misuse, to bed, and make sure that people don't defile this great teacher. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I pray that it will serve as truth unto godliness. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed the material I present on Twitter at polemicists, or here at Truth Unto Godliness on YouTube, then please consider donating either through PayPal at polemicists, as is seen on the picture screen here, or on Patreon at Truth Unto Godliness. I hope to edify, to serve with truth unto godliness. Thank you, and God bless.